Welcome to Rescuing the Rule of Law, a series of shows exploring major threats to our 250-year-old American system of equal justice and due process for all. It's brought to you by the organization Maine Lawyers for the Rule of Law. It's this rule of law with its checks and balances that protects the rights and freedoms of all of us and stops us from falling into a dictatorship. Hello, I'm Roger Cates, a former state senator and Augusta attorney. You know, if you understand baseball, you understand the rule of law. Baseball only works because everyone has agreed to the rule book before the first pitch. The bases are always 90 feet apart. There are always 3 outs in an inning, and a walk is 4 balls, whether you're a rookie or a superstar. Now, imagine that weren't true. What if the umpire said, well, I'm going to give this batter 4 strikes. He sells a lot of tickets. Or I'm going to give this team 4 outs when they're up. The manager has friends in high places. Well, that wouldn't be baseball. That game would be rigged. The rule of law in our society is the same. It means that the rules are written down in our Constitution and our laws and court decisions. They're known in advance, and most importantly, they apply to everybody the same way, not based on power or money or race, not based on who you know or who returns your phone calls. We don't have a special strike zone for VIPs. And if someone wants to change the rules, there's a process for doing that. That's what makes the system fair and trustworthy. Sure, it doesn't always work perfectly, and there are times in our history when we haven't always lived up to this ideal. But it's what we strive for in a democracy. But now it seems as though this rule of law is in danger. In this first show, we'll look closely at what's happening as far away as Minneapolis and as close as Portland and Lewiston. Serious violations of the rule of law by federal immigration police known as ICE, and how we should respond. I'm pleased to introduce our panel. Carol Garvin is the legal director of the ACLU of Maine. Sue Roach is the executive director of the Immigrant Legal Advocacy Project. And David Weber, a civil rights attorney in Maine for 40 years and one of the founding members of the Maine Lawyers for the Rule of Law. Let's begin. Carol Garvin, American Civil Liberties Union of Maine, welcome. Tell us a little bit about your organization, and can you then tell us what we've been seeing here in Maine with respect to ICE involvement in our state, particularly with what you believe to be unlawful detention of people? What kind of legal action your organization has taken in response to these cases?
So the ACLU of Maine, we are the statewide affiliate of the National American Civil Liberties Union. So our primary goal is to protect the civil rights and civil liberties of all Mainers in the courts and in the legislature. And in particular, especially in recent months, one of our big areas of focus has been protecting the civil rights of our immigrants in Maine. We represented a client who I'll call Jose. He and his family had fled Venezuela, which was their country of origin, because they were being threatened by members of the military after they protested the regime there. They fled to the U.S., they entered, and they were apprehended, but then quickly processed by our government and released on their own recognizance. They then lived in Maine for a number of years, applied for asylum, and they were given a court date for their asylum hearing in 2027, so years away. So in the meantime, Jose applied for and got work authorization. He got all his papers in order. He got a job. He started his life here with his family. And then suddenly, just a few weeks ago, he was arrested on minor charges of disorderly conduct by local police. And then the local police took him into custody and handed him over to ICE custody. And that is when things got really scary for him. So he was essentially taken in the night and held without any communication. We didn't know where he was. His attorneys couldn't find him. His family couldn't find him or reach him. And he was held incommunicado. Eventually, what we did was we got involved as his attorneys, and we filed what's called a writ of habeas corpus. So essentially, that's, a fancy Latin phrase, but essentially what habeas corpus means is that if you are held by your government in imprisonment, then you have the right to go to a judge and say, this detention is unlawful. And the government then has to prove that it has a valid, lawful basis for detaining you. And if it can't, then the court orders the release of the person being held.
Before this all started, how many habeas petitions had been filed in Maine in the last 10 years?
Maybe a handful, 1 or 2 immigration habeas petitions. in decades. And then in the last 6 months or so, there's over 50 that have been filed. The courts are finding the detention is unlawful, and so they're ordering people's release.
So, Carol, you think that might be related to the quota of 3,000 people arrested a day? I know one federal judge recently said he thought that quota was driving ICE to arrest anybody of color because their job was to meet a quota. Is that you think that's part of the problem here?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been seeing trends of just way more stops in Maine and across the country. And I think they're often seemingly happening just indiscriminately. It's not that ICE is coming in with any probable cause or even knowledge of who they're stopping. They're just making these stops based on what seems like racial profiling often. And so, we've seen several trends in terms of the kinds of habeas cases we're bringing. One is just like the story I was just telling for Jose. So people who, are here, they're going through the lawful process, they've applied for asylum, they're waiting because that system is backed up. And in the meantime, they're getting stopped and then they're getting held. And the government's position is they have to be mandatorily held, and they don't even have access to a bond hearing where they could prove, look, there's no public safety risk here, there's no flight risk. And so there's no reason for the detention. And so those cases are getting granted again and again in the federal courts.
Are they playing games about trying to get around the right of a person to get to a judge? Are they trying to evade that and doing things that you perhaps wouldn't expect from the federal government?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say what we would expect from the federal government, but I think what we're seeing is that there's very often people detained in Maine are getting really quickly moved out of the state. And because the law says you have to file your habeas petition in the place where you are at that moment of filing, that means if you've already been moved to Massachusetts or Louisiana, you have to file in that other state. So that makes it exponentially harder to get access.
Are they at least telling the lawyer what they're doing before they do it?
There's, just like our client I was just describing, they're often held completely incommunicado. So we can't find them, their loved ones can't find them. We only filed in Maine because we thought he was still in Maine. And so we had to say, look, we think our client's in Maine, and so that this court has jurisdiction, but we didn't even know for sure.
Are they letting folks call a lawyer?
There's inconsistent access to even having a phone call.
Is that unusual for the federal government to not let you call a lawyer?
I mean, I think there's real precedent for always having access to counsel, and we're seeing that getting completely impeded here.
So 50 or so petitions filed. Do you have an idea of how many of those people had actually been moved outside of the state of Maine before you could get their hearings?
Yeah, so that's the 50 are the people who were still in Maine, so those were able to go through the process. There have been many more where we weren't able to do that in time, and so we are starting to be able to, sometimes we can work with lawyers out of state, but there's many more petitions for Mainers stopped in Maine who were moved out before we could get the petition. So
you file these petitions, and assuming your client's still in Maine, it comes before a judge. This is a federal judge, I assume?
That's right, yeah.
And what's the defense of the federal government? We should be able to continue to hold this person because... What do they say? Yeah.
So first, the first step is usually we're filing these emergency petitions. The federal court is, this is new to many of the judges that there's now dozens of these every week. They're acting really quickly, and right away they're filing orders that the person can't be moved out of Maine. So that protects for a limited period the jurisdiction. And then generally the government is saying they've taken a new position and that they now think folks like our client, Jose, are subject to mandatory detention under sort of a new idea of how the immigration law should be interpreted, a completely different interpretation than we'd seen for decades. The judges, by and large, are not agreeing with that interpretation, and so are ordering that they get a bond hearing, and then people are getting released.
So we usually hear federal judges take 2 years to do anything, but you're telling us that in Maine, our federal judges are actually acting within hours to uphold people's rights. Is that correct, true?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think in Maine and all over the country, judges are acting with, a speed I've never seen. So we've had cases, I'm sure that ILAP has as well, where we file 7, 8 p.m. We have an order by 7 a.m. There's an emergency line, so courts are acting really quickly. And sometimes, there's been rare situations. Sometimes ICE isn't abiding by the orders. And even then, the courts are acting really quickly to issue remedies to make sure that if they're there, for example, no transfer order was violated, they're saying, look, bring that person back immediately, or in some cases, they're ordering people's release as a sanction for the government violating their order.
Susan, let's ask you about where things are from your perspective, again, with the Immigration Legal Assistance Program. What are you seeing here in Maine with your involvement of these folks, particularly people who are asylum seekers?
So the Immigrant Legal Advocacy Project is a statewide immigration legal aid organization. We have offices in Portland and Lewiston. We also have a rural Maine project where we have staff who assist clients in different rural areas of the state. And primarily what we do is direct immigration legal services, so representing people in humanitarian forms of immigration relief like asylum, victims of crimes and domestic violence, unaccompanied minors, and more especially over the past year, we're doing a lot of detention and removal, and we're also doing the habeas petitions that Carol was explaining. And in terms of what we're seeing, through that work, we've really seen over the last year that the administration has a real strategy of trying to deport as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, and as efficiently as possible, with a particular focus on communities of color. And we are really seeing an attack on our asylum system as part of sort of core to that, which we have, certainly a lot of asylum seekers in Maine, so we're really seeing that. And just to, sort of take a step back and explain what asylum is. Asylum is a legal protection. It came about following World War II and the Holocaust, when lots of other international treaties and international laws were coming into effect. And there was really sort of a recognition of the international community that we need to have a process for people who are at risk of persecution or who have been persecuted in their home countries to be able to flee somewhere else where they can apply for safety and protection. So the U.S. has signed on to those treaties. We've also codified that in U.S. law, where there's a statute that provides for anyone who arrives in the United States, regardless of how they get here, regardless of what type of status, or even if they have any status, whether they're at the border, arriving at an airport, or if they're already in the country, they have the right to apply for asylum. There's a very narrow definition they need to meet, showing that they meet one of 5 protected grounds. There's several things they need to prove, but there is a process. There's 2 different ways people apply, sometimes in immigration court and sometimes at the asylum office. Now, what's happened because of a real lack of funding, there's no real congressional appropriation to support the asylum process. It's paid for by immigration application fees, which are getting higher and higher every year. So what we're seeing is just a real backlog of cases. People are waiting years and sometimes even over a decade for the adjudication of their cases. So people who enter the country, they're following the lawful process, they get a work authorization 180 days after they've filed their application, they can apply. And sometimes they're here for several years, waiting for that application process.
They're checking in, by the way, periodically.
Sometimes people are required to, depending. Sometimes if people are in an immigration court process, they are required to check in with ICE on a regular basis. And what we've seen over the years, in Maine, in the last couple decades, we've had a lot of asylum seekers moving here, thousands of people who are somewhere in that process, following the lawful process. And, until this past year, we had never seen people in that lawful process, unless they had committed a crime or were somehow found to be a danger to the community. We'd never seen those individuals getting detained. And we've really seen in this last year, both through the policies of the administration sort of changing the law, as you were talking with a baseball, like changing the law. So overnight, somebody's asylum application somehow completely changed through executive orders and policy changes, and then also through a real enhanced and often unlawful ICE enforcement policy. So much of what Carol was describing, where we're seeing, people being swept up, detained, transferred out of state, held sort of incommunicado, making it very difficult. And really what they're trying to do is to get people to self-deport or to give up their right to even have a hearing. I can sort of explain, sort of on a human level, how this impacts by, sharing the story of a client we'll call Anna. Anna was a client from South America, and she had been horribly abused in her home country. She had been subjected to forced sterilization. She was severely disabled as a result of her abuse. She has regular seizures that are very, very serious. She was actually a victim of human trafficking and trafficked into the United States. She was able to escape her trafficker and then got to, unfortunately, somebody who was not an immigration lawyer who helped her prepare and file an asylum application that had a lot of mistakes in it. She was later subject to an unlawful arrest and was then turned over to ICE, and she was being held at the Cumberland County Jail. And that's when ILAP encountered her, and we ended up taking on her case. So what happens when you're detained and you have an asylum case is, when you're not detained, your case can go on for years. You have a lot of time to prepare. You can sometimes save money to hire a lawyer. when you're detained, your case is real fast-paced. So she suddenly had a hearing in 2 weeks. We had to correct her application, get expert witnesses, collect, what normally is hundreds of hours of preparing for a case, got prepared, went into the hearing, and on the second day of the trial, the ICE attorney came in, and also I should say that her claim was a very, very strong, having been subjected to forced sterilization. It was sort of almost a prima facie asylum case. She should have just been granted very easily. The ICE attorney came in on the second day of the trial and said, oh, no, we're going to pre-termit this case, which is what's happening in many, many cases. We have this agreement now with Honduras where they will accept people who have no connection to Honduras to deport people back there. So they were moving to deport her to Honduras. So the immigration judge, this was a little bit of a new policy for her and wasn't quite aware of all the requirements, was sort of ready to move forward with that agreement with ICE. And our attorney had to go in and really argue and show, well, actually, it doesn't apply to our client because of the date that she entered the country. And if it hadn't been for that, she would have just been on her way to getting deported. So we were ultimately able to get her, she was granted what's called withholding of removal, but that wasn't the end of the case. What happened was that the ICE attorney appealed the case, and then they moved her very quickly to Burlington, Massachusetts, in really kind of horrible conditions there. She was not having access to medical care or to her medication. And she was being forced to sleep on an upper bunk, even though she has seizures, and that was really risky for her. Even though the immigration judge ordered for her to get medical care and ordered for her not to be removed, ICE lied and said that she was getting her medical care, even though she was not. And then they transferred her to Louisiana, where the conditions were even worse. Very cold conditions, very little food. She was having 5 seizures a day. The judge ended up actually ordering her to be released, and they did release her. They brought her to the airport and just left her in her orange jumpsuit. It is definitely not a one-off. It is what we've been seeing over the last year and really accelerated recently in this, what ICE was calling Operation Catch of the Day, where we saw a lot of ICE officers coming in and just really horrific, abusive arrests, and real, as Carol was describing, a lot of just racial profiling. They were claiming to be focused on the worst of the worst. Of the over 200 people that they arrested, very few seem to have criminal convictions. ILAP was able to screen 70 of those cases for loved ones who contacted us, and of those 70, very few, I'm not sure even if any of them had criminal convictions, but most of them were people with pending applications, many who had asylum. So many people following the law with no criminal histories, families, community connections, all of the things that make them eligible to not be detained. And for most
they're working in Maine, contributing to our communities. Because I know some folks that came here in 2019. Mom and dad, mom was pregnant. They have a 3-year-old, and they come in very, very difficult travel. They check in at the border. They do everything right. They come to Maine. They get their work permits. They apply for asylum, and the process takes forever. They have excellent jobs. They have 3 children, and now they're pregnant with the 4th child. And then ICE shows up in Maine and is taking people that are totally innocent with no criminal record. So they're afraid to go get food for their 3 children. Pregnant mom's afraid to go to medical appointments and to go to the hospital. We're running out of people in Maine. We're running into trouble, and what we really need are go-getters that are willing to contribute, which the immigrants tend to be in that group.
Absolutely.
David, let me go up, move on if I could.
Sure.
So you're in private practice. You have decades of experience trying cases in the state of Maine, and you're the first lawyer in the state to sue ICE for its Operation Catch of the Day here in Maine. Tell us a little bit about your case and what you see on that side of it.
Yeah. Well, why don't we start with clip 1, which will show you just a little taste of what happened so you can see it for yourself.
Hi. How you doing today? Good, and you? Are you following us? Yeah. Okay, so what you're doing is called impeding federal law enforcement, okay? It's an 18 U.S.C. charge 111.
I see.
First and only warning. If
Thank you.
continue to impede us and follow us, you will be arrested.
Yeah, except
okay?
I'm not impeding you.
Okay, you just openly admitted that you were following us, so
I am following you. I'm not impeding you. I'm observing you.
it is impeding.
No, it's actually not.
After one warning, keep doing it, we'll pull you back out and arrest you.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay.
Carol and Sue have been explaining this, terrible invasion of rights, racial discrimination, and also violation of due process, which are the 2 cornerstones of the American justice system. They're in our Constitution: equal protection and due process. And what makes the situation even worse is when the folks say, hey, that's not America, and try to stand up and protest or monitor what's going on, the response is, oh, what we're doing is totally above board, watch us all you want, which is what It's what the law requires. ICE is saying, we're going to put you in jail if you watch us. And they're doing it in a bunch of ways that I think is it's close to a 10 on the danger 1 out of 10 scale for Americans, so that if you go to a protest, whether it be against abortion or for abortion, you don't expect the U.S. government to then come to your house and say, hey, if you do that again, we're going to arrest you, or we're going to put you on a domestic terrorist list. So that's what they're doing in this situation, and that's something we've never seen in the history of our country, where if you protest or exercise your First Amendment rights, they're calling it a crime, and that's a lie. It is nowhere near a crime. First of all, the First Amendment protects it, so it couldn't be a crime. And then secondly, there's a lot of law that says, of course we have to be able to observe what's going on. Like the judge doesn't wear a mask or a hood in our court of law. We have everything's open in court, right? So and the same situation here when law enforcement is doing things. Unfortunately, we know we have to be watching them because sometimes most of them do a good job and they're excellent, and some of them do bad things. And so we need to be able to see that and call it out and have accountability, or else we have essentially a secret police. And the other problem here is that we see our Department of Justice has been taken over by the president. So we have a situation here that led to lawyers in Maine back almost a year ago now saying, hey, this has never happened before. This is not, there's been civil rights violations and serious things, but this is a systemic attack on the American legal system, which is the whole purpose of it is not to protect lawyers. Rule of law is not my favorite phrase. It is to avoid dictatorship, and mainly it's to make sure the people can govern themselves. It's the government of the people. So that's what the rule of law, not my favorite expression,
right,
is all about. And so right now we're seeing with the president taking over the Department of Justice, prosecuting people he doesn't like. Okay, that is a death knell of a democracy. So right now we're not really a functioning rule of law country in many respects. We're falling down the list of democracy. So that's why Maine lawyers for the rule of law are sort of raising the alarm bells.
Right, and for your client, the concept is the same as you said. If you're at an abortion rally, it doesn't matter if you're for further abortion rights or against them. You have a right to be there, to protest peacefully, to speak up, and not to be threatened.
Right,
with
and everybody
consequences.
knows that, except the current president doesn't know that. He thinks you go to jail if you criticize them on TV, or if you say the military should follow, the Constitution. He says you should be executed for that. So we have a unusual situation where the leader of a democracy doesn't understand democracy.
So people may have different views of immigration law and what our overall policies ought to be and how many of what groups we should be letting in or not. But there's got to be a consensus on the fact that some of these things are just wrong as Americans. What other examples have you seen over the last several weeks here in Maine?
Well, they were shooting paintballs at people at a Home Depot who were observing them engaging and saying things and maybe using some strong language. And then they shot paintballs at them from 300 feet away and hit their cars just because they were observing and expressing some displeasure. I think one of the most, graphic examples is the woman who was video recording ICE not doing anything particularly, she wasn't getting in their way in the least, and they weren't doing anything particularly urgent. And they started taping her, and we can show you a clip of that.
Why are you taking my information down?
Because we have a nice little database.
Oh, good.
And now you're considered a domestic terrorist. So
We're videotaping you?
So she's told she's on a domestic terrorist list because she was exercising her First Amendment right. In America, we don't have a domestic terrorist list for enemies of the president or the administration. I mean, we've had a covert list in the past, but that is completely against the First Amendment because the whole point is the government cannot threaten people for doing what the First Amendment protects, or else that's the end of the First Amendment. And so putting somebody on a domestic terrorist list is like, you might not be able to fly, you might get arrested. And people high up in the administration were saying, yes, we are keeping a domestic terrorist list. And Mainers were saying, they were calling up civil rights. Is that legal? They didn't know. It's not legal. It's totally evil and it's totally wrong. And I just hope all lawyers say that with one strong voice together. This is not a political issue. Republicans have First Amendment rights, Democrats, independents, we're all in this together. So this should not be, it's not a partisan issue in the least.
people may have different views about immigration law, but many people might agree that if someone is here, even on legal status, and they've been convicted of a serious crime while they've been here, that person should not be able to stay in this country. So ICE comes into Maine. How many arrests have there been? And how many of those people fit that kind of category that we perhaps all could agree we're not happy to be here?
Yes, I don't know the exact number. There were over 200 people who were arrested, and I believe I've heard that they had 10 people they said had criminal convictions. But what I would say is that we have a legal process. If people have serious criminal convictions, there is a method for getting deported. There's a process. People don't need to be racially profiled and pulled out of their cars and had their windows banged in with babies in the back and swept out to Louisiana to sleep on a tarmac. There is a lawful process. We have a rule of law that we follow, and it's expected that people have a right to have their hearing in front of the judge. The trial attorney will present their side, the defense attorney will present their side, the judge will decide whether the person should be deported, and that's the process. But what we're seeing is just as I was saying before, this real goal of just deporting as many people as possible, creating a climate of fear so that, the family you were describing and others, people are sheltering in place because they're so afraid. Even people who are naturalized U.S. citizens, just the fear that creates is causing people to just give up their right to follow the legal process and just to self-deport.
I think another concern is our congressional delegation, Senator Collins, et cetera, were asking for this information, and she was raising a concern it doesn't seem like the worst of the worst. They're not giving her that information. They wouldn't give it to any of our delegations. I'm very concerned that it was 10 at most, and those aren't even all convictions. Out of over 200, that means they're willing to go after 90% innocent people to get their quota, and that's pretty terrifying.
Your organizations, I take it, have limited resources. Do you see attorneys around the state stepping up and saying, how can I help? Can I take on any of this work?
Yeah, we've seen just a groundswell of offers of help, and we have now a sort of network of attorneys who are up for filing emergency habeas, which, as we talked about, sometimes has to be filed, within an hour, maybe at 9 p.m. on a, Thursday night. And so people are really stepping up. They're learning this law. Our judges are stepping up, the clerk's offices. So everyone, I think, is realizing the emergency we're in and trying to meet the moment. So that's been incredible to see.
Same with you all.
Absolutely. And I would say there's also a lot of collaboration. ILAP and the ACLU of Maine and Refugee and Human Rights Clinic at Maine Law have been working really closely ever since the very beginning. Even before that, we do a lot of education and outreach and other things together. But just sort of anticipating this operation, we were really able to sort of collaborate. ILAP set up we have a detention request form on our website so that people who need assistance if their family members have been detained, they can sign up. We were able to respond to everybody. We've been able to file, I think, over 20 habeas petitions. They've all been successful so far, at least in preventing people from getting transferred. So many, attorneys willing to step up and help, and organizations kind of coming together. And really seeing communities come up. I mean, just seeing people push back and letting, our immigrant neighbors know that they're wanted here, that we don't want ICE operating in this way has been really encouraging.
I can just add an angle.
Sure.
This work is amazing. We are so lucky to have these two organizations. Another part of it, though, is it's kind of defensive. We're just getting people out of jail that should not have been put in jail and should not have been terrorized. So my firm is focused on suing them because in our system, we're supposed to hold accountable people that break the law. And it's a little hard to do that at the moment because of the way the rules are written to favor the government. But we were able to sue ICE folks under the Federal Tort Claims Act. Right. And I would just recommend that folks go to our website, Maine Lawyers for the Rule of Law, and see we've asked Congress to make 14 reforms about ICE, one of which would be to expand the current civil rights law that works against local government officials when they break the law, has worked very well for a long time, and to add federal, which the federal government should be the most compliant with the law, not above the law. So let's turn this into a civil rights advance. And because of all the pain and suffering people have gone through, let's make something out of it. Let's make our civil rights laws stronger so next time this doesn't happen.
Thanks, David. And thank you, Sue. And thank you, Carol, very much for being here. That's all for our show tonight. I'm Roger Cates, host of Rescuing the Rule of Law and a member of the nonprofit group Maine Lawyers for the Rule of Law. I'd like to thank my guests, Carol Garvin from the Maine ACLU, Sue Roach from the Immigrant Legal Advocacy Project, and David Webert from Maine Lawyers for the Rule of Law. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you'd like to donate to our efforts, you can find us at Maine Lawyers for the Rule of Law at mainruleoflaw.org. Thanks and good night.